But we really appreciate you joining us this evening for our 4th annual Forest and Fire Learning Series. Tonight is the 4th installment in a series of 5. And let's see. Here we go. All right. Still working through our technical issues, but I think we're just going to go ahead and jump in and say that my name is Emily Swindell. I work for the Forest Team here at Mountain Studies Institute alongside Dana Hayward, the Forest Team's Partnership Coordinator at MSI. Tonight, we're going to be diving into the science of wildfire smoke and its impacts on air quality and climate with Dr. Jessica Gilman from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So at any time, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to go ahead and put those into the comments section. And as I navigate here to my screen, oh, that's all right. Let's see. I'm not going to share my screen. I'll just say that, let's see, Dana, can you please make me a host? Thank you very much. All right. Here we go. All right, great. So as I said before, our speaker this evening is Dr. Jessica Gilman, a research chemist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Boulder, Colorado. And her research focuses on understanding how various emission sources and secondary chemistry affect air quality and climate. And I'm going to pull this up for our audience real quick. And here we go. And so, and if you would like to see, if you'd like to learn more about her research, we are going to include her information and links that you can check her out at the website you see down below. But since we're starting a little bit late, I'm going to go ahead and just hand things off to you, Dr. Gilman. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, so you should be seeing my title slide. Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us online, and thank you so much, Emily and the Mountain Studies Institute, for inviting me to speak today. As Emily mentioned, I've been working at NOAA now for 15 years, and there I study a wide range of organic molecules in the atmosphere that contribute to air quality and climate impacts. And there are many, many different sources of these chemicals in the air or to the air. But wildfires are something that we've been studying now for over 10 years. And to me, they're just the most complex and also the most just sort of mesmerizing and fascinating sources to study. So for today's talk, I really did my best to pull in little snippets of information that I find incredibly interesting, and hopefully you will too, as we discuss the chemistry of wildfire smoke. So the presentation today is organized around the 3 questions that I have on the title slide here. So we'll discuss, what smoke is made of, what biomass is made of. In the middle, what's the smoke impacts our health and both the health of the atmosphere. And lastly, sort of a show and tell of how we do the measurements of smoke and of course why they're so important. Okay, next slide. All right, so sort of as a grand overview, I wanted to start with this figure here because it's really a map of many of the topics that we'll be talking about over the next few minutes. So wildfire smoke, which is shown in the gray there, can degrade air quality even at very great distances from the ignition source. And so here, each of the markers represent an air monitoring site, and they are colored by the air quality index, where the darker and warmer colors indicate more hazardous air. And so this is from the airnow.gov website. There's some more useful websites that have popped up on the corner there. And let me do one thing. Actually, let me escape this real quick. There we go. Okay, so now we're back. Didn't want to use those timings. So each of the markers here represent a air monitoring site, and the color is determined by the air quality index on the right. This was taken from the airnow.gov website on August 22nd of last year, when we were being impacted by the huge number of really large fires out in California. And so you can see in the Central Valley there, where you have the really deep purple markers there, you had really, really bad air quality. But you can also see all of the markers underneath that big gray blob of smoke also had poor air quality. And these are, hundreds to thousands of miles downwind of the fire source. So at NOAA, part of our research is to understand the emissions that are occurring right at the source, but also how they change and impact air quality and climate as that smoke ages and is transported throughout the atmosphere. So we'll go on to the first question, which is, what is smoke actually made of? And I like to give the answers right up front. So smoke is a very complex mixture of many different things, including toxic gases, particles of all shapes, sizes, and colors, and it's produced by a range of different combustion processes. So the composition of smoke, which we'll talk about, will most largely depend on the fuel that is burned. But as you'll see, the temperature and the conditions at which it burns actually has a very large impact on the smoke composition. So if we look first at sort of the bulk composition, and this is the chemical composition of hardwood fuels on the left. So say a tree is only actually about 50% carbon by mass. It's also composed of a lot of oxygen atoms. Hydrogen, there's quite a large number of them, but hydrogen is the lightest element on the periodic table, and also nitrogen. And so when that initial chemical mixture gets burned, it produces a range of different molecules and particles that are shown on the right there. So carbon dioxide is the most abundant fuel, and so its emissions there are listed in grams per kilogram of fuel burned, followed by carbon monoxide, which is an air toxic and represents less efficient combustion processes. Volatile organic compounds, so these can be hundreds of different molecules all under that one name, and VOCs are what I measure. And we have, again, a full range of particulate matter. Here it's delineated by its size, which we'll talk about in a bit. Methane, an important climate gas. Nitrogen oxides, which are air toxic and also important for air quality issues. Black carbon, which is essentially the soot, and many other components. And so what we'll talk about a little bit more in the next section are the fact that each one of these molecules has a different impact on human health as well as the health of the environment. So it's important to know what's in the smoke if you really want to understand the impacts. So if we dive a little further into what biomass is actually composed of, the main chemical structures are cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and then the green component of the plant, which is mainly composed of chlorophyll and amino acids. And what's interesting is the cellulose and hemicellulose are these really large repeating units, glucose units, different kinds of sugars. And it's almost like a big sort of plastic where these units just keep repeating over and over again. And they provide the structural support. Lignin is a resin-like polymer, kind of acts like glue within the tree. It decays slowly within rotting vegetation, and interestingly, it also gives smoke its flavor. So if you know anybody that's really big into barbecue, it's the lignin that gives smoked foods their flavor. And the nitrogen is mostly composed in the green parts of the tree. So it's, again, the chlorophyll and amino acids. And this is an important distinction amongst wood smoke versus wildfire smoke. So the wood that we burn in our fireplaces is mostly of the cellulose and hemicellulose, very little of the green plant material. And so wood smoke will have a less nitrogen in the smoke than a wildfire, which burns all components of biomass. And if we look again in even further chemical detail, on the bottom left, I have a picture of lignin. So this is the chemical structure. It's sort of a shorthand that chemists use. But you can see there's, again, a whole bunch of different molecules. The carbon atoms are where you see a bend or an angle here. And then we have oxygen atoms, hydrogen, etc. So these really large, really complex molecules. And you can imagine when you start to add heat to that as part of the fire, those large molecules break down into hundreds to thousands of much, much smaller molecules. I won't go through all the names here, but I've given, again, some of the chemical structures. What's important here is that just like on that previous table, every single molecule will have a different impact on human health. So for example, formaldehyde is listed here. Toluene and benzene, these are known carcinogens, really bad for you. Ethanol is something that we enjoy in our alcoholic beverages. These molecules that have the double bonds shown by the pair of double lines there mean it's highly reactive, and that can contribute to air quality issues well downwind of the fire source. So again, it's important to know the full composition of the fire if we want to understand the impacts. So we talked about the biomass, but now let's talk about the fire itself. So there are several different fire processes that will result in the different gases being emitted. So if we start with combustion, and so what most people think of with fire is that flaming combustion that's so colorful and eye-catching. That's a high temperature process, but there's also a lower temperature smoldering combustion. And you can already start to see between difference of the temperatures listed, but also the composition. So flaming combustion will have a lot of CO2 and nitrogen oxides, and the smoldering glowing combustion is slightly less efficient, so it'll have more of the carbon monoxide as well as the VOCs. It's also interesting to note that the flaming combustion actually occurs in the gas phase. So the flames are burning the gases that have been emitted from heating the fuel itself. So it's not the fuel that's being burned, but the gases that were released from the fuel that's actually being burned. And smoldering combustion will occur on the surface of the material that's being burned. But another process that you may be less familiar with is one that's called pyrolysis. So this is a thermochemical reaction that occurs without oxygen actually being part of the reactant. And so there's two different temperature regimes, just like on the left. So we have a high temperature and a low temperature pyrolysis. And the main difference here, I'll give you an example on the next few slides, is the different chemical makeup of these two different processes, which both occur on the inside of the material. So it's important to remember that biomass in the real world, it burns incompletely and very unevenly. So all of these processes and many more that I haven't listed are all occurring at different times, to different amounts. So that's one of the things that makes biomass burning a little more complicated. So here's just one example. This is work done by a colleague of mine, Kanako Sakamoto, who's a visiting scientist from Japan. And this is some work we did at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory a few years ago in 2016. And this is just to show you on the top graph in the middle that the composition of the smoke actually changes as the fire progresses through all of those different combustion processes that we've shown. So the total ion signal for everything that we measured is shown in red. And then she pulled out two different molecules in blue. We have naphthalene, the chemical formula is shown on the right, so that's two benzene rings, and syringol in green, which actually gives smoke. It's sort of noticeable smoky smell. And then she's pulled out pictures from the burn that we did in the laboratory there, shown on the right, where on the left we have more of the flaming combustion, and you can see that the blue and the green traces don't exactly follow each other. And at 4,069 seconds on the right, we get to see more smoke. And during that phase, we see more of the oxygenated aromatic there. And what she did that is truly an advancement to the science is she was able to use a statistical model. So this is a way to mathematically represent what we're measuring in real time with these instruments, and able to look for the different molecules, and this is now 574 different ions that she's using, to see how they correlate with one another. And that mathematical formula was able to separate all of those ions into two main factors. And that's basically putting light chemicals together, how they vary over time, over the course of the fire together. And they are related then to the temperature factor, the high and low temperature for the pyrolysis. So the key finding here is that she was able to show that even though we have this incredibly chemically complex mixture, and we studied a whole range of different fuel types, it's actually the temperature of the fuel for all of these Western fuels that we studied that was most indicative or determined what the composition of the smoke actually is. So this is one way where we can take something really complex and actually simplify it a bit. And this is really important for what we'll talk about towards the end, which is how we can implement some of these measurements, these really detailed in situ chemical measurements, into these larger scale atmospheric models. Temperature is something you can measure really well from space. And so that's a really great way to use the proxy as a way to estimate all of the other VOCs that can be emitted just knowing the temperature of the fire itself. Okay, so moving on to what smoke can do to both human health and the health of the atmosphere. And of course, we had so many fires impacting the Western United States last year, including all throughout California. And here's the Golden Gate Bridge. So for human health, smoke contains some highly toxic gases, as well as, again, a full range of particles that can be inhaled. And once they're inhaled and are able to go deep into our lungs, they cause a whole number of ailments. So there's absolutely nothing healthy about breathing smoke. For the atmosphere, it's a little more complex, where you're emitting all of these different gases as well as those particles. And ultimately that can alter Earth's energy balance. And that's through greenhouse gases, which can absorb that solar radiation, as well as the different physical properties of the particles that can scatter or absorb sunlight, again, altering that energy balance, leading to potentially a warmer climate. So when we think of human health, we use the equation at the top, which is essentially the risk or exposure hazard. So you want to know what it is you're being exposed to, how much you're being exposed to, and how long that exposure is occurring. And so if you just look at the last two terms, the concentration and exposure time, it kind of falls into two general categories, acute versus chronic. So you may have, like we did last summer, if you're living in California right next to all of those fires, or even here in Colorado, we had quite a few. If you have really high concentrations, but maybe you're only exposed to those high concentrations for a very short period of time, that would typically fall under the acute category. But you also have to consider the chronic exposure. So now, as we'll see, smoke is becoming more prevalent throughout the Western United States. The number of smoke days are increasing. And so now you have potentially a slightly lower concentration, but you're now being exposed to this particulate matter for much longer periods of time than you may have been exposed before. So those are two things to keep in track of, the concentration and the exposure time. So for the pollutant, as I mentioned, smoke has toxic gases, one of which carbon monoxide, right? That's something that can cause suffocation. And there are many other known carcinogens, such as formaldehyde, benzene, toluene. Honestly, the list goes on and on. They're generally lower concentrations, but again, if you're exposed to even low concentrations for significant amounts of time, it can start to cause some health issues. But for smoke, the really important toxin is particulate matter. And we're most concerned with particles, both the composition, but also the size of the particle. So the smaller the particle is, generally the more dangerous it becomes for human health. So the large particles will actually be filtered out in your nose. They'll hit the back of your throat. Maybe they'll get you coughing, but your body will sort of naturally filter out some of those larger particles. They also fall from the sky a lot faster, and so they tend to not accumulate so much in the air. But for these really fine particles, which is called PM 2.5, that means it has a diameter of 2.5 micrometers, which is 20 times thinner than a single human hair. And the little graphic on the right kind of gives some visuals for the size. Have the ability to follow air currents and essentially make all these bends around corners and down into your lungs, and can get really deep down in there and cause all kinds of issues. The other thing that can happen is once all of these gases and particles are emitted into the atmosphere, they don't just go away. They may float downwind away from you, but then that just means they're impacting someone else. So we have to also consider what happens to those emissions once they're emitted into the atmosphere. And for what we study, we want to understand how new particles can be formed, as well as this new molecule called ozone here that can be formed downwind of these fires, as well as any other pollution source. And sort of like fires in the fire triangle, where you have a source, you need oxygen, and you need a spark. For oxygen, you have that same kind of triangle, but here we have these volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, and generally a radical source, which is mediated by sunlight. And once you get those three ingredients together, you can form ozone and particles, and both of those will further degrade air quality and have climate impacts. So with fires, you're interested in both the primary emissions, but again, what happens as those emissions travel downwind. So I won't go too much into the direct health impacts because I'm a research chemist and not a medical doctor. And many of us have already had to deal with these kind of symptoms, since we are often encounter wildfire smoke throughout the summers in Colorado. So of course you can get headaches, irritated eyes, coughing, difficulty breathing. It affects your respiratory system, your cardiovascular health. The health risks, of course, will be different for each individual person. They tend to impact older adults, children, and any of those with pre-existing health conditions. So again, there are a full range of really not great health impacts when it comes to smoke, and particularly PM 2.5. And the best way to improve your health is by limiting exposure. And so easy things to do are to use those masks that we've now been using for COVID, staying indoors, minimizing the time outdoors where the smoke tends to accumulate. You can install better air filters within your home. I've gotten MERV 14 filters and just taped them to box fans as a simple sort of $20 fix for improving the air quality within my own house. So many different ways that you can limit your exposure. But one thing to consider is that now that we're seeing more area being burned, fires are getting larger, more intense, mostly due to climate change, and that's going to continue to happen. So we're seeing this increase in PM 2.5 from smoke. So this is the results of a nice study by Burke et al., where they looked at the changing risk and burden of wildfires throughout the United States. And so you see the trend here on the increasing amount of PM 2.5, and that's shown as a percentage point. If you look at the actual concentration, it's right at 11 micrograms per cubic meter, and this is a yearly average for the entire Western US. The EPA limit currently right now, sorry, that's a typo, is at 11 micrograms per cubic meter, or sorry, 12. So we're right near that limit there. But this increasing smoke is erasing some of the gains that we've made in improving air quality. So over the last few decades, there's been, better technology, we're cleaner fuels, we're using green energy. Air quality in of itself has improved greatly over the last few decades, However, this wildfire smoke is starting to degrade some of those gains, and in fact, even reversing them. So the study shows that smoky days per year are increasing. So again, this gets towards that chronic exposure list or exposure risk. And the predicted particulate matter is also increasing per year. So now we're getting closer and closer to that annual limit where the EPA says it can become hazardous. All right, and so one quick slide on the health of the environment and our atmosphere. And so I mentioned, we have all of these greenhouse gases and particles, all of these things that are emitted into the atmosphere not only impact human health, but impact the health of the atmosphere. And this was just one story I came across in the news that I thought was pretty fascinating and a great little story to tell. And of course, wildfires aren't just happening in North America. They're not just happening in the United States, happening all over the world. We saw, many news stories of Arctic fires. Just a few months ago, Australia had its record fire year as well. So last year, in the Southern Hemisphere summer, 70,000 square miles in Australia were burned. And I looked up the area of the state of Colorado, and roughly if you took from I-25 west, that's approximately the area that was burned in Australia. And these were extremely energetic fires, so they're putting the particles high up into the atmosphere, all the way up into the stratosphere, where a study estimated that there was 1 million metric tons of smoke injected into the stratosphere. And that smoke, the higher the smoke is injected into the atmosphere, the longer it tends to stay there. And that also means the greater the impacts that it has on climate. And so these really large fires are actually more akin to small volcanoes than they are to campfires or small Western fires here. And a few things that you may not think about so much, because many of the fires happen in the summertime, but when the smoke falls back to the ground and lands on anything that is snow covered, so on the right there's a picture of New Zealand glaciers, and I liked how the news article called it caramelized snow. So that is all the smoke that's now been deposited on that, what would have been a nice white pristine snow. That has a lot of implications in regard to climate change, because that's changing how much sunlight can get reflected back to space, right? White snow, you get that sunburn when you're skiing because of the sun reflecting off of the snow. So that's not being reflected as much. But that can also mean that snow and ice can melt a little bit quicker. And so now you're starting to impact hydrology cycles. And in this case, because they're glaciers and other snow-covered regions in the Arctic, you're now changing, potentially even impacting sea level rise and those kinds of issues. And so again, once the smoke's in the atmosphere, it can have some really long-term, quite large effects on all of Earth's various systems. So something to keep in mind. All right, and then on to the last question, which is how and why do we need to study biomass burning emissions? So this is really just kind of a show and tell for some of the fun experiments that we've been able to do. The picture shown here is of a pyrocumulus cloud, pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which is essentially a thunderstorm formed from the emissions of fires. And this was taken from the cockpit of the NASA DC-8 research aircraft that we used for one of the studies that I'll be telling you about. It's just an amazingly beautiful picture. So I'll show you that we use a variety of state-of-the-art instrumentation, both in the lab and the field, and we combine that with a range of different satellites, all kinds of different models, in order to study the wildfire emissions across all scales. So that means time from now into the future, even into the past, and space again. So all throughout the atmosphere, from the ground all the way through the stratosphere. And then long distances downwind as well. And ultimately, that data is used to refine and test the atmospheric models that we use to predict and better understand the impacts of wildfire emissions, especially in a changing climate. So as I mentioned, one of the tools that we use is a laboratory setup. So this is the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. So on the left here, we have this room. So it's actually a 3-story tall chimney. This hood can actually retract and change its height depending on the settings that you need. But they have the ability to, set realistic looking fires. We use Forestry Service personnel to go out and harvest the fires, collect all kinds of information, including that chemical content of the fuels, take pictures of how it's set up, fuel loading in the area, all of those different kinds of bits of information. And then they'll set up the fire, those fuels, much smaller quantities, but they'll try to set it up as realistically as possible. So we'll look at duff and pine litter, green needles, as well as the stems, all different components of biomass fuel for any one of these specific fuel types. And then we'll light the fire. The smoke, in this case, will go up the chimney, and all these little things off the side, and there's many, many more not shown in the picture, goes into a room like this, where it is just chocked full of instrumentation, all sucking that smoke into each one of these different individual instruments that are all designed to do one specific measurement, either a chemical or physical property of smoke. And so we actually had 3 rooms, I believe. There's some measurements that are right at the top of the chimney. This is one of their wind tunnels. There's actually 2 wind tunnels. We don't use them, but that's what these are on the right. And then another one down on the first floor. And there was actually another chamber within the main burn chamber there that housed some instruments. So once we light the fire, again, you can measure the entire stage of the fire from ignition all the way through completion. And so we're able to capture both the flaming and the smoldering emissions and the mix of the two, like I showed in that earlier time series. An additional thing that we can do in the laboratory is essentially mimic sunlight. So we're inside a lab, we're trying to get the emissions as close as they are to the source, but we also want to understand better ways of determining how the atmospheric impacts may be. And one way we can do that are these photochemistry chambers, where we essentially turn on lights that mimic natural sunlight, and then you can inject whatever oxidant you're most interested in studying, ozone, hydroxyl radical, nitrate radical, any of these things that we would normally find in the atmosphere. You can individually put them into these photochemistry chambers and study the reactions, right? So this is a way that we can do very controlled burns, different fuel types, as well as the chemistry. The other nice bit and advantage for the laboratory setup is that we're able to do replicate burns so that we get much better statistics. Essentially, you're repeating your experiment over and over again. And of course, you can just fill these rooms full of instrumentation. And so here we have some of the team members. I believe this is only about half of the people that were involved in this one experiment that took course a little over a month in Missoula in 2016. So it's a really neat facility, and I believe it's getting renovated right now, which will make it all the better. So while the lab work has some really great advantages of making things somewhat simpler, they don't obviously replicate what happens in the real world. And so for that, we need to do field measurements. This is where we're taking our instrument right out to the fire itself in order to measure it in real world conditions, with sunlight, with wind, with mixtures of fuels, all of the things that happen during a natural wildfire. So over the last few years, there have been many scientific agencies, so led by NOAA, NASA, as well as the National Science Foundation, and many other government agencies, university colleagues, even private industry, all collaborating on these large-scale projects that have taken course over the last few years, studying the composition of smoke all the way from the ground out to space. And each one of these different platforms, so we've got various aircraft, the NSF C-130, the DC-8 aircraft, which I'll show you next. This is the one I was on. We have these smaller NOAA aircraft called Twin Otters. So they are able to fly much closer to the ground. NASA ER-2, which is a very high altitude aircraft. And then we had various ground sites as well as mobile labs where you could drive right up to the smoke in order to get as close as you can to the emission source. So all of this together represents one of the largest scale field intensives ever done to study Western wildfire smoke. So here is a picture I took of the NASA DC-8. So it's a very large aircraft. It's a very old aircraft. I believe it's from the 1950s, but it's been completely souped up. So these are new, even bigger engines than originally was made for it, and many other modifications. And so you'll notice here that a lot of the windows have been replaced, and we end up putting a lot of extra things on the outside of the airplane. So each one of these are window plates with those same inlets now pulling outside air straight to the instruments that are inside the plane there. So I know the bottom is a little bit hard to see, but it's basically the payload floor plan. So everywhere where you see a green square here, these are seats for a scientist to sit in during the flight. And then all of the orange material are the instrument racks, or in this case, different gas bottles that we need to fly. And then up front are where all of the NASA crew themselves can monitor power and other aircraft readings as we go along. And then there's a little lounge area in the back. Not much, but the bathrooms are there and a little cooler for your lunch and some cold water while you fly. Most of the flights last anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, and they're not super comfortable. And again, a picture, should have made it bigger, a very large collection of scientists. This is again only probably about a third of the scientists that were involved just for this one project that took many years to plan and was executed pretty flawlessly. So we have to employ all of these different instruments because there isn't one single instrument that's able to measure all the different parameters that are needed to better advance our understanding of wildfire smoke. So I will go ahead and start this video. So this is a video I took of us actually flying. It's starting towards the rear of the plane, moving forward towards the cockpit. So this was taken sort of on the way back from one of the flights there. So it's now gotten pretty late in the evening. We tend to take off mid-afternoon to late because we want that fire to essentially grow, to have enough energy to where the smoke can be lofted high enough to where the aircraft can actually measure it. On each side, you can see the different instrument racks. Many of the racks had, at least one, sometimes up to 4 or 5 different instruments in each of them. And then this is the main station for the flight scientist that can control and keep an eye on all of the different parts of the aircraft needed to make sure we have power and everything else for all the different instruments. Okay, so here is a satellite image of how we actually did the sampling of one of the fires. This was the Williams Flats fire from August of 2019 that occurred in central Washington. The star here is, of course, where the fire has originated. I'll hit play here. You can see the smoke, and then as the day goes on, you see the fires start to pick up, but you can also start to see some of the wind shift, and then that is the flight track of the DC-8 itself. You'll see that we come in, would do these longitudinal runs, high altitudes, that way we can map the smoke plume itself. And then we go down in altitude to do these various transects. I'll go ahead and play it again. Left to right, because we want to go from edge to edge of the fire, and we also go from near the source all the way down wind of the source. And then on the second pass here, we actually had to shift our flight path in in mid-flight in order to account for the wind difference that was going on. And then here's a new video that I put together. So this is what the pilots actually see of that exact same fire. So this is played 10 times fast. So we don't fly this fast, but I didn't want to take up too much time. And you can see, in order to sample the smoke, you have to fly through the smoke. And these pilots were honestly pretty fearless to be flying into smoke, in this mountainous terrain. They're not slurry bombers or anything like that. Most of the fires that we flew weren't being actively fought, and so we didn't have to worry about airspace so much. But we did have several crew members that would coordinate with the Forestry Service to make sure that we weren't in airspace that we shouldn't be in. Okay, so here is a map now of the actual measurements. So this is now that same flight track that showed on that satellite image. Along that flight track, I've now colored it by carbon monoxide, which is one of those gases that's emitted from the wildfire. And then each of these little purple markers are where we've collected a single discrete air sample. So this is for my instrument. There are many others that do just continuous measurements, but for my sampling, we actually fill a little canister with air during the flight. We unload those canisters, ship them back to Boulder, and do the analysis here in Boulder. So the bottom are the same samples, but now as a time series. So for instance, that the movie where the pilots were flying are roughly where my marker is here, just before 1 a.m. UTC time. So you can see the first pass of the fire, and then between the first and the second, the smoke kicked up quite a bit. And you can see the wide range of concentrations that we measure. And so a clean background is well under a single ppb of benzene, but in this case, the smoke is well over that, 10 to 20 times higher than what you see in a clean background. And so there are many different ways that we can use this data from the time series, one of which are looking at different ratios of various tracers. So in this case, we can look at VOCs and how they correlate with carbon monoxide there. We like to use ratios quite a bit in the atmosphere because they help account for the effects of mixing and dilution. So even though here you have wide ranges in the actual magnitude, how much of the VOC you have, but you can see all of those data points fall along basically a single line there, meaning it has a similar composition, even though it's very concentrated to low concentration, you get the same composition for this particular VOC, which is not highly reactive and is a really good tracer for combustion. But one of the other things that we did for the FireX project on the DC-8 is we also looked at agricultural fires. So we spent half of the time in Boise, Idaho. We picked up and packed everything and flew the plane over to Salina, Kansas as a way to sample agricultural fires all throughout the southeastern United States. So while wildfires, have these just amazing photos and often get a lot of attention in the news because they're so large, agricultural fires are smaller. However, there's a lot more of them. So if you actually compare the area burned and the amount of smoke emitted, the collective sum of all of these small agricultural fires are actually on par with what we would see in a typical fire season for these large western wildfires. So it's not an insignificant source by any means. So here on the right is a graph just comparing the composition between what we see in the western wildfires versus the agricultural fires for these various chemical classes. And I won't go into too much detail here, but you see what's most interesting to me are the difference in these oxygenated VOCs that are much greater in the agricultural fires compared to the western wildfires. So things like this group of furans, they're oxygenated, but they're also highly reactive. So on par with this, the agricultural fires are more reactive and may contribute more to photochemical ozone and even downwind particle formation than some of these large western wildfires. So we're still digging through a lot of this data and trying to figure out what all the differences are, and also understanding why we have those differences. It's clearly going to be linked to the fuel source itself, and also likely how, again, those fires are burned. You know, slashing these agricultural fires, they tend to be very hot, very fast fires and die out, and so you have less of that smoldering pyrolysis emissions compared to the Western wildfires. So lastly, why do we do all of those measurements? Ultimately, like I said, it gets incorporated into these atmospheric models. There are many different kinds of atmospheric models. This one just happens to be my favorite. So this is the high resolution rapid refresh smoke model. It is a NOAA data product, and you can access the data in real time using the website listed there. And what this is it's actually predicting where the smoke will go. This is a forward-looking model, not a backwards, not a you know, just satellite representation. So this is the Cameron Peak Fire and I believe the East Troublesome Fire in Colorado, and you can see the total integrated smoke plume just flowing across much of the eastern United States, and then all of the California fires that were also occurring at the same time. And so we want to know and be able to predict where the smoke is going to go. And eventually we'll be adding a lot of that chemical formulation that we learned from all of our different measurements into these chemical models. So we won't know just where the smoke is going, but how it's being transformed as it travels downwind. And this will be be used to help guide various you know, health-related impacts. So you can say, you know, let's cancel the track meet that's going to occur outside tomorrow because we're going to be impacted by heavy smoke, etc. So it's a really neat model. It's still in development, and again, you can access all of the information on the website there. It relies on satellite measurements of fires. It's updated every 6 hours, and then the output is for every hour looking forward, up to 18 hours. And so it's continually refreshed as new information and weather information comes in. All right. So to summarize everything, wildfire smoke, as we've shown, is a really complex mixture of toxic gases and particles. And we care about it because it degrades air quality, certainly when you're near the source, but also at very great distances downwind from that ignition source. And that means it can impact, you know, millions of more people than those that live within the communities that are being most impacted. On all accounts, wildfire smoke is harmful to human health, and PM 2.5 is something to consider, you know, reducing your exposure to and keeping an eye on as it appears to be increasing across the Western US. And lastly, wildfire smoke can have some of these large and sometimes unexpected and long-term effects on these other Earth systems. So as the climate continues to warm and drying out, these fires will become more prevalent and, you know, potentially even larger than they are now. And so we really need to understand how that fits into the larger Earth system. So with that, please, you know, stick around for questions. I see a few in the chat already, and then feel free to email me if you have any questions offline.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that great presentation. You really covered a lot of ground there. So we're going to take a few extra minutes. It's almost 7, but we've got quite a few questions lined up here for you. And the first of those has to do with the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory. Is there any risk of smoke particulates escaping the chimney at that laboratory?
Yeah, so so one of the things that one, it was smoky inside the laboratory by all of our instrumentation, but the way the fires work is that you would set it up, you'd conduct the burn, do your measurements, and before you could start the next fire, each fire would last about an hour. It gets vented outside, but again, the size of the fires that we're doing in Missoula honestly aren't that much bigger than what you would have in your fireplace at home. So it is certainly a source within Missoula, but it's not necessarily like it's a huge bonfire, all day, every day, only when the experiments are running. And again, it's altogether not much different than what you'd have at the chimney in your house.
All right. Our next question is, do pilots get specially trained for these flights? So the flights I'm guessing that you were talking about where they're flying through plumes of wildfire smoke.
Yeah, so again, the NASA pilots are truly incredible. I mean, the NOAA ones are too. The NOAA pilots, when we fly on the NOAA planes, they're called the hurricane hunters. So they actually fly into the hurricanes. They penetrate the eye wall, do all the measurements inside the hurricane, and then fly home. The NASA pilots don't do hurricanes, but they are incredibly brave, being able to fly quite low to the ground. Again, for those agricultural fires, I can only imagine what the farmers were thinking, having this huge, 4-engine jet kind of dive bombing their fields there. But yeah, the pilots absolutely got some special training, essentially talking with the same training that the slurry bombers and things undergo to just understand the mountainous terrain. And of course, with the smoke, your visibility is impacted. An interesting thing, when you're going straight over the top of the fire, you get those thermals. So you can often kind of be thrown out of your seat for a little bit and then go back down. And then, of course, all the maneuvering left to right, up to down, all of that, and some of this mountainous terrain is pretty incredible. And again, for a big, big jet engine to be able to do that is pretty mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. All right, our next question is, do particulates from wildfires play a specific role in ecological or geologic or other processes that, if they were not present, would be problematic?
I don't know if they would, if we had well, yes. So one of the things that aerosols do, and this even includes clouds, is that they reflect, the white clouds reflect that radiation back out to space. So that helps cool the atmosphere down. And so if we had no clouds whatsoever, that would certainly impact quite a few ecological cycles for certain. I'm not sure about geologic cycles, but again, that composition of the particles, because they the larger particles themselves tend to, fall from the sky. They are one source of, putting nitrogen back into soils and all kinds of things. So there's a wide range of impacts from particles, for sure. Sorry, I can't go into more detail than that.
Oh, that's great. Our next question is, somewhere in the archaeological record, are there indicators of periods of worse air quality? And do they last long enough to be captured in a record like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can only imagine the answer is yes. But I don't have any direct examples to give. But one of the interesting ways that we study air quality in the past is, of course, through ice core samples. And so there's a lab here in Denver. It's actually the Ice Core Laboratory. They have the largest collection of ice cores in the entire United States that are preserved for, for long-term records. And basically, you drill down into the ice, pull the ice back, and any air that was trapped from millennia ago that then got trapped within the ice itself, those little air bubbles, get melted and reanalyzed. So that's how you start to rebuild these climate records. And a lot of things, just like sort of tree rings, and you can tell when there are fire seasons and whatnot, you can start to see when there was large amounts of soot, dust, other forms of aerosol, kind of creating these little striations in the ice as well. So there are ways to record past air quality issues, but I don't have any more info than that. But I do find it fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I didn't know that about Denver. So the next question is, are there any collaborative research studies being done to identify increases in new onset asthma, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or other lung disorders? It seems this might help capture public attention of the dangers you describe.
Yeah, again, I'm not on the medical side, but there absolutely are. I mean, there's more and more studies coming out. I mean, air quality and air pollution has been around for a long time. And like I said, we're making great strides, particularly in the United States and many other highly industrialized countries, moving to greener and greener energy sources and so forth. So we're making these great strides, but we still have room to improve. And thinking of other countries that may use biomass burning, burning peat and dung and all of these things in order to do their cooking, there's an even greater impact on human health in some of these less industrialized countries. So overall, air quality is one of the largest drivers in human mortality. And so it is certainly important, and there are a number of people working on it and all the different impacts of that. And I can only hope that the public becomes more and more aware of them and thinks that they're important too.
I agree. I think we're going to make this our last question. We might have one more after that, but we'll go ahead and go with this one. Does your research offer any insights into the differences between smoke from wildfire and from prescribed burns?
Yeah, so there's the one thing that prescribed burns help us do better than what wildfires do is that I think it was actually your last speaker mentioning how much time, effort, and energy goes into by the Forestry Service to do the prescribed fires. And with that, they'll go in and they'll do soil samples, they'll collect leaf litter, they'll do all of the different fuel loading analyses, everything that we would want to better understand what happens when it burns and is emitted into the atmosphere, we get from prescribed burns that we don't necessarily get in quite as much detail from the wildfires. But ultimately, if it's a prescribed forest fire compared to a Western wildfire, they're not much different other than the fact that we get that extra bit of sort of sleuthing and extra bit of information from the Forestry Service that we may not get from just any normal fire.
All right. I think this is going to be our last question here. Is the relative toxicity of the VOCs vary with the weather or time of day, humidity? For example, do the effects change the air downwind of the fire is much more humid than near the smoke source?
No, that's actually a really good question. So humidity does play an important role. And most of what humidity impacts is the aerosol formation. And any molecule that wants to partition from the gas to an aerosol will tend to do that when humidity is higher. Of course, most fires occur under low humidity events. So as I mentioned, what gets emitted from the fire, those initial VOCs, can transform as they move downwind. And so that composition may change. One interesting molecule that I mentioned is formaldehyde. So that's essentially what embalming fluid is. So it's, again, not good for you. It's prevalent in any number of products. It has many uses. But it's emitted in the fire, but it's also formed downwind. So the people who study formaldehyde formation in fires really have their work cut out for you, because it's both disappearing and forming, often at the same rates and from different molecules, and it's formed from a whole bunch of different molecules. So it ends up being a really interesting sort of mystery to keep looking at in formaldehyde.
Wow, great. Thank you very much. That's fascinating. All right, folks, let's see. I'm gonna pull this up for you. I'm gonna say thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you to Aaron and Trevor and Vicki for your questions. We really do appreciate you throwing those in the chat. And I wanted to say thank you again for joining us this evening, for tuning in, and for bearing with us at the beginning of our live stream as we kind of work through some IT issues as humble scientists. We do appreciate it. And we want to say that please don't forget to join us next week for our final installment of the Forest and Fire Learning Series. This is where we're going to be learning about fire readiness and seasonal outlooks for the San Juan National Forest with Alex Graff and Jen Boone and Brad Petruska. And before you leave, please help us out by filling out our survey that's located in the comments section, especially if you would like an opportunity to be entered into a raffle giveaway drawing for a combination of one of these totally awesome prizes. So thank you so much to our donors for this raffle giveaway. So thank you to San Juan Mountains Association, to Durango Outdoor Exchange, to Marie's Bookshop, Pagosa Mountain Sports, and to Mountain Studies Institute for allowing us to have these prizes to give to our audience, to you. And I want to give a very big thank you to all of our sponsors who helped make this event possible. Without you, we couldn't bring all this information and bring these great speakers to the table to share their expertise. So thank you so much to all of you. So I'm gonna move on to stop sharing this screen right now. And just wanna say again, thank you all so much for tuning in this evening. If you have any additional questions, you can put them in the comments section or reach out to Dr. Jessica Gilman.